Maria pressed the worn-out soles of her shoes against the marble floor, feeling completely out of place. The Blackwood mansion was something out of a dream or a nightmare. Everything was too perfect, too expensive. The chandelier in the foyer could probably pay her rent for a year. The air smelled of polished wood, expensive perfume, and something else, something old, something forgotten. She clutched her bag tightly as the butler, a stiff-looking man in his 60s named Mr. Holloway, led her down the endless hallway. "You'll be caring for Mr. Blackwood in the East Wing," he said in a tone that was neither warm nor cold. "His condition is stable, but he requires round-the-clock care. The doctor will brief you shortly. You will follow instructions exactly." Maria only nodded, her nerves tangled in knots. She knew the name Alexander Blackwood. Who didn't? He was one of the richest men in the country. Ruthless, brilliant, and untouchable. He had built an empire from nothing. Women worshipped him, men feared him, and now he lay in a coma, helpless. As they reached the grand double doors of his bedroom, Mr. Holloway stopped and turned to face her. "There are rules, Miss Maria." Her grip on her bag tightened. "Of course. You are to bathe him every morning, ensure he is turned every few hours, and monitor his vitals. Speak only when necessary. Do not go through his personal belongings. Do not wander the house at night. And above all," his voice grew low and firm, "if anything unusual happens, you report to me immediately." Maria swallowed hard. "Unusual?" He gave a thin, empty smile. "You'll understand soon enough." Before she could ask, he pushed open the doors, and Maria's breath caught in her throat. The room was enormous, the walls lined with dark bookshelves, the windows stretching from floor to ceiling, covered with heavy black curtains. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and something metallic, something cold. And there he was, Alexander Blackwood, lying on the massive bed, his dark hair a sharp contrast against the white pillows. His face was too perfect, too still, like a fallen god. His body, once powerful, was now lean, motionless. Tubes ran from his arms, monitoring his vitals. He looked like he was merely sleeping, but Maria knew better. A man like him didn't just end up in a coma. Someone put him there. She pulled herself together. This was a job, nothing more. She had to act professional. No matter how surreal this felt, she wasn't here to ask questions. She moved to the bedside, her fingers trembling, as she reached for his wrist, checking his pulse. Strong, stable, but cold to the touch. "Good," said a voice behind her. Maria spun around, startled. A woman stood in the doorway, tall and elegant, dressed in a silk suit. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, like she could see right through Maria. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Carter, Mr. Blackwood's physician," the woman said, stepping inside. "You'll be reporting to me directly." Maria nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Carter walked to the bedside, checking the monitors. "You've been given the rules?" "Yes." "Then you understand how important it is that Mr. Blackwood remains undisturbed. His condition is delicate. There's no telling when, if, he will wake up." Maria hesitated. "Do we know what happened to him?" Dr. Carter's sharp gaze flicked toward her. "No." It was a lie. Maria could feel it, but she didn't push. "You'll start his morning care now," Dr. Carter continued, checking her watch. "I'll be back later to review his condition." And just like that, she was gone. Maria turned back to Alexander, exhaling shakily. She reached for the warm cloth and basin prepared on the nightstand. This was it. Her first time touching a man who was completely unaware, completely vulnerable. She began wiping his face, careful, gentle. As her fingers grazed his strong jaw, a shiver ran down her spine. It felt strange, like touching something forbidden. As she moved to unbutton his shirt, the silence grew heavy. She could hear her own breathing, the distant ticking of the clock. Then, a twitch. She froze. Had she imagined it? Her eyes darted to his hands. They were still, too still. She let out a slow breath and continued. It was just nerves. She dipped the cloth back into the warm water, moved to wipe his chest. And then she saw it, his lips parting. A breath escaped, shallow, raspy. Maria's heart stopped. And then, in the silence of the vast, cold mansion, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A whisper. Soft. Hoarse. Barely there. "Run!" Maria's breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes widened in horror as she stared at Alexander. Blackwood's motionless form. Had she imagined it? She must have. He was in a coma. Patients in comas didn't speak. They didn't whisper warnings. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she cautiously leaned in. "Mr. Blackwood?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nothing. His chest rose and fell steadily, the rhythmic beep of the monitors unchanged. His lips were still parted slightly, as if frozen mid-sentence. Maria swallowed hard. It had to be her imagination. Her nerves were playing tricks on her. She forced herself to move, gripping the cloth with trembling fingers as she continued wiping his chest. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The heavy curtains blocked out the morning sun, making the room unnaturally dim. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She tried to focus. This was just a job she desperately needed. But as she moved the cloth down his torso, a sudden chill crept down her spine. Something felt wrong. His body was warm from the water, but underneath, his skin felt too cold, as if he had been lying here, waiting. She hesitated before trailing the cloth down to his abdomen, her hands shaking. The sensation was subtle at first, but then his fingers twitched. She saw it this time, not imagined, not a trick of the light, a full twitch. Maria's breath left her in a shaky gasp. She stumbled back, knocking the bowl of water off the nightstand. It crashed to the floor, sending water splashing across the polished wood. The sound shattered the eerie silence. Maria clapped a hand over her mouth, her heart hammering. The door burst open. Mr. Holloway stormed in, his sharp eyes scanning the room before locking onto Maria. "What happened?" he demanded. She could barely form words. She looked at Alexander, then at the spilled water. I think he moved." Mr. Holloway's expression didn't change. It was unreadable, cold. "You're mistaken," he said, flatly. Maria's stomach clenched. "No, I saw it." His fingers twitched, and I thought I heard— "Patients in comas often have involuntary movements," Mr. Holloway interrupted. "It means nothing." Maria opened her mouth, then shut it. Something about the way he said it, like he was too quick to dismiss it, made unease crawl over her skin. She glanced back at Alexander. He was still motionless. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe it really was just a muscle reflex. But it hadn't felt like that. It had felt like a warning. "Clean this up," Mr. Holloway said, his voice clipped. "And remember, Miss Maria, you were hired to care for Mr. Blackwood, not to imagine things." With that, he turned and strode out, leaving her standing there, her hands shaking. Maria bent down, her mind racing as she cleaned the mess. She needed to calm down. She was overthinking. But then her eyes caught something. A single wet footprint, near the foot of the bed. A footprint too large to be hers. Her blood turned to ice. She wasn't imagining things. Something was very, very wrong in this house. Maria's fingers trembled as she scrubbed the water from the floor, but her eyes remained fixed on the footprint near the foot of the bed. It was faint, fading into the polished wood, but it was there, large, male. And it hadn't come from her. Her heart pounded as she looked back at Alexander Blackwood's still body. It wasn't possible. He couldn't have moved. Could he? She swallowed hard, shaking her head. Maybe she had missed it when she walked in. Maybe it was left by Mr. Holloway or Dr. Carter. Maybe— A cold shiver ran down her spine. She was lying to herself. Something was wrong in this house. She hurriedly finished cleaning the spill and left the room, her footsteps echoing in the long, dark hallway. The Blackwood mansion was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made her skin crawl. She needed air. Maria made her way downstairs, through the grand hall and out onto the stone balcony that overlooked the sprawling gardens. The fresh night breeze hit her face, but it did nothing to calm her racing heart. She replayed everything in her mind, the twitch, the whisper, the footprint. Had someone else been in that room? She glanced around, suddenly aware of how isolated this mansion was. She had taken this job because the pay was too good to refuse, but now she was starting to wonder why they were paying her so much. What was she really hired for? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft creak behind her. Maria spun around, her breath hitching. A figure stood at the edge of the balcony, shrouded in darkness. Her pulse jumped to her throat. "Who's there?" She whispered, taking a step back. The figure moved forward, and the dim light from the house illuminated a woman's face. Young, beautiful, but there was something haunting in her eyes. "You need to leave," the woman said softly. Maria's body tensed. What? The woman took another step closer, her eyes darting around nervously as if afraid someone would hear. "You don't belong here. You need to get out before it's too late." Maria felt a chill wrap around her. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer. She just shook her head, looking almost sad. Then, before Maria could say another word, the woman turned and hurried back into the shadows, disappearing into the night. Maria's breath came fast and uneven. Who was that? And why did she sound like she was warning her of something deadly? Maria gripped the balcony railing, her mind spiraling. Something wasn't right in this house, and she had the sinking feeling that whatever it was only just beginning. Maria barely slept that night. She lay awake in her small room, in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling as the shadows shifted and danced in the dim moonlight. The warning from the strange woman on the balcony played in her mind over and over again. You need to leave before it's too late. Why? What was she afraid of, and more importantly, why did Maria feel the same creeping dread in her bones? Sometime in the early hours of the morning, she finally drifted into a restless sleep, and that was when she felt it, the presence. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, but it was there. Heavy, suffocating, like unseen eyes pressing into, her skin watching. Maria's breathing grew shallow, her body frozen in place. She wasn't alone, something was in the room with her. She forced herself to open her eyes, and what she saw nearly stopped her heart. A figure stood in the corner of her room, cloaked in darkness. Tall, motionless, the outline of a man. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't obey, paralyzed. The figure remained still, as if waiting. A deep, suffocating dread settled over Maria's chest. Then the shadow shifted, moved. Step by step it advanced toward her. Maria's breath came in short, ragged gasps. The closer it got, the more she felt an unbearable cold seeping into the air. Then, just as it reached the edge of her bed, she blinked, and it was gone. Maria gasped, shooting up from the mattress, her body drenched in sweat. Her eyes darted frantically around the room. Empty. No one was there. Her hands trembled as she clutched the blanket to her chest. Had she imagined it? Was it just a dream? She didn't know. But one thing was certain. She couldn't stay in this house much longer. Maria forced herself to her feet, still shaken, and checked the time. Almost dawn. Her shift with Alexander Blackwood was about to start. Despite the icy fear in her veins, she gathered herself and made her way toward his room. When she entered, the air was thick, heavy, just like in her nightmare. But something was different, something was wrong. The curtains were no longer fully closed. A thin slit of early morning light streamed into the room, illuminating part of Alexander's face. And for the first time, his eyes were open. Maria froze. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. His deep, piercing gaze locked onto hers, unblinking, intense, alive. Then, in a voice hoarse from disuse, he whispered, "They know you're here." Maria couldn't breathe. Alexander Blackwood's eyes, dark, piercing, aware, bore into hers with an intensity that rooted her to the spot. This wasn't a coma patient. This wasn't the lifeless, unresponsive billionaire she had bathed just hours ago. He was awake, and he was watching her. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she took a step back, gripping the doorframe for support. Mr. Blackwood?" she stammered, barely recognizing her own voice. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then, after what felt like an eternity, his lips parted. "They know you're here." A chill ran down Maria's spine. "Who?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze flickered toward the door. A flicker of fear, real, raw, passed through his expression. Maria turned instinctively. The hallway outside was empty, but the air had changed. It was heavier, darker, like something unseen had slithered into the room, curling around them, waiting. Maria's hands shook. She turned back to Alexander, but his eyes had already drifted shut again, his body sinking back into eerie stillness. No, this wasn't normal. She needed to get help. Heart pounding, she rushed out of the room, her footsteps loud in the oppressive silence of the mansion. She sprinted down the hall, nearly colliding with Mr. Holloway at the top of the grand staircase. His sharp eyes narrowed as he steadied her by the shoulders. "What's wrong?" She sucked in a breath, still, trembling. "Mr. Blackwood, he woke up, he spoke to me." For the first time, she saw something flicker across Mr. Holloway's cold, calculating face, something that looked a lot like fear. "You must be mistaken," he said quickly, his grip tightening. Maria shook her head furiously. "I saw him. His eyes were open. He was awake. He said—" She stopped. What was she supposed to say? "He warned me that they know I'm here?" It sounded insane, but she knew what she saw. Mr. Holloway's expression darkened. "Miss Maria," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "Mr. Blackwood is in a coma. The doctors have confirmed it. If you're seeing things, I suggest you get some rest before making such ridiculous claims." Maria's stomach twisted. He was lying. Why? She wrenched herself from his grip, stepping back. "I know what I saw," she said firmly. Mr. Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you should forget it." Maria's breath caught. There was something in his voice. A warning. Not a suggestion, a threat. She swallowed, suddenly aware of how alone she was in this massive house. How small, how powerless. But she wasn't crazy. Alexander Blackwood had woken up. He had seen something. And now, someone didn't want her to know the truth. Maria forced herself to nod, feigning submission. "You're right, I must have imagined it." Mr. Holloway studied her for a long moment before stepping aside. "Good girl," he murmured. Maria turned and walked away, her pulse hammering. She had lied. She wouldn't forget. She was going to find out the truth, even if it killed her. Maria spent the rest of the day feeling like a prisoner in the Blackwood mansion. She tried to act normal, to keep her head down, but every time she passed one of the silent house staff or felt Mr. Holloway's cold stare from across the hall, the warning in her chest grew louder. "They know you're here." Who was they? And why did Mr. Holloway seem desperate to convince her that Alexander Blackwood was still in a coma? That night, Maria made a decision. She wasn't leaving this mansion without answers. The forbidden door. After making sure her footsteps were silent against the marble floors, Maria crept back toward Alexander's room. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she eased the door open. The room was dark, only the glow of the monitors casting eerie green shadows across the walls. Maria took a step inside. Alexander lay there, motionless, his face a perfect mask of silence. But she didn't believe it. Not anymore. She tiptoed closer, holding her breath as she reached out to touch his hand. His skin was warm. His fingers twitched slightly beneath hers. A spark of hope lit inside her. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, "I know you can hear me. Please, wake up." For a long moment nothing happened. Then his eyelids fluttered. Maria's heart lurched. His lips parted, his voice hoarse but real. "Get out." She sucked in a sharp breath. "No. I need to know what's happening. What's wrong with this place?" Alexander's fingers curled slightly around hers, his grip weak but desperate. Before he could speak again, a noise outside the room made Maria jerk away. Footsteps. Heavy. Slow, deliberate. Someone was coming. Her stomach clenched with fear. Maria backed away and slipped into the bathroom, pressing herself against the wall just as the bedroom door creaked open. Through the crack in the door she saw them, Mr. Holloway and two men dressed in black suits. They walked straight to Alexander's bedside, looming over him like vultures. "Still fighting, are you?" Mr. Holloway murmured. Maria bit her lip to keep from gasping. Alexander was awake, they knew. One of the men reached into his coat and pulled out a syringe filled with a thick, colorless liquid. Maria's blood ran cold. She knew what that was. A sedative. They were forcing him to stay in a coma. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she watched the needle sink into Alexander's IV line. His body jerked slightly, his lips parting in protest, but it was no use. Within seconds, he stilled. His eyes fluttered shut. A cold, cruel smile crossed Mr. Holloway's face. "Good boy," he whispered. "Sleep tight." Maria's hands curled into fists. They were keeping him under. But why? And more importantly, what would they do if they found out she knew? Maria's entire body trembled as she stayed hidden in the bathroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. They're drugging him. They're keeping him in a coma on purpose. The horrifying realization sent a cold wave of terror through her. This wasn't just about a billionaire in a coma. There was something far darker happening in this house. Through the crack in the door, she saw Mr. Holloway straighten his suit. "Keep the dosage steady," he instructed the men in black. "No mistakes. If he wakes up again, it'll ruin everything." Maria clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. "Ruin what?" One of the men nodded. "Dr. Carter will check. In tomorrow. But we may need to increase the sedative. His body's resisting it." Mr. Holloway scoffed. "Of course it is. Blackwood's always been a fighter. But it doesn't matter. He's not leaving that bed. Not until the contract is finalized." "Contract?" Maria's mind raced. She had no idea what they were talking about, but it was clear. Alexander Blackwood wasn't sick. He was being kept like this. The men murmured a few more words before leaving the room, closing the door softly behind them. Maria stayed frozen, in place, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I have to get out of here." But she couldn't just leave now, not when she knew the truth. She had to do something. Maria slowly emerged from her hiding spot, her legs shaky as she rushed to Alexander's bedside. His face was still, his body unresponsive. But now she knew why. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered desperately, gripping his hand. "I know you're in." They're drugging you. They don't want you to wake up." No response. She shook his arm gently. "Please, if you can hear me, fight it." Nothing. Maria swallowed the lump in her throat. She couldn't let them keep him like this. She wouldn't. With one last deep breath, she made her decision. She was going to wake him up. Maria dashed into the adjoining bathroom, rummaging through the cabinets. There had to be something to counteract the sedative. Her hands shook as she checked every bottle. Painkillers, antiseptics, vitamins, nothing that could help. Then she saw it. A small vial labeled naloxone. Her eyes widened. It was used to counteract opioid overdoses. Could it work against the sedative? She didn't have time to hesitate. Maria grabbed a syringe from the emergency kit, drew the liquid into it, and rushed back to Alexander's side. "Please let this work." With a deep breath, she injected the antidote into his IV line, praying she wasn't making a fatal mistake. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a sharp intake of breath. Maria jumped back as Alexander's body jerked, his fingers twitched, his head turned slightly. Then, with a ragged gasp, his eyes flew open, wild, confused, and furious. Maria's chest tightened. "Mr. Blackwood." His dark eyes locked onto hers, sharp and aware. He was awake, and from the look on his face, he remembered everything. Alexander's breath came in ragged gasps as his dark eyes darted around the dimly lit room. Maria could see the tension in his body, the way his muscles strained against weakness. The sedative was still wearing off, but he was awake, and he was furious. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Maria swallowed, hard. "You're in your mansion, but they—" She hesitated, unsure of how much to say. Mr. Holloway and some men, they've been drugging you, keeping you in a coma. I don't know why, but that bastard, Alexander rasped, gripping the bed sheets weakly. His eyes darkened, the realization hitting him like a storm. He tried to sit up, but his limbs betrayed him, still too weak from weeks, maybe months, of being drugged. Maria quickly caught him, steadying his body before he could collapse. "You're still recovering," she whispered urgently. "They'll be back soon. We need to get you out of here." Alexander let out a slow breath, his mind clearly racing. "No," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "I'm not running. This is my house. My company, my life. If Holloway thinks he can take it from me, he's dead wrong." Maria shivered at the cold determination in his voice. Even weak and barely able to move, there was a dangerous power in him. Something lethal, something that had kept him at the top of the world before they tried to steal it all away. She helped him sit up against the pillows. "What do you remember?" Alexander rubbed a hand over his face, his fingers trembling with residual exhaustion. "Not much. The last clear memory I have is being in a board meeting, then a headache, a drink. After that, nothing but darkness." Maria's stomach twisted. "They must have poisoned you, put you in a coma to take control of your company." Alexander exhaled sharply, rage simmering beneath his skin, and they almost got away with it. His eyes flicked to her. "You woke me up. Why?" Maria hesitated. She barely knew this man. He was a billionaire, someone who lived in a world far beyond her reach, and yet she had risked everything to save him. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. For a moment, Alexander just looked at her, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then, ever so slightly, he smirked. "Then I owe you my life." Maria shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. But we do need to get out of here. Holloway and those men could come back any second." Alexander's smirk faded. "No, we're not escaping." His voice dropped into something cold, something dangerous. "We're finishing this." Maria's breath hitched. "You can barely stand, then you'll help me," he cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I have to make a call. We need to move fast before Holloway realizes what you've done." Maria nodded, quickly grabbing his phone from the nightstand. His fingers were slow at first, but once he started typing, muscle memory took over. Within minutes, he had sent out several encrypted messages. Maria watched in awe. Even in his weakened state, he was methodical, ruthless. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was a man who knew how to take back control. A low beeping sound echoed from the monitors, making Maria's heart jump. Footsteps, coming fast. Alexander's jaw clenched. "They're coming. Hide." Maria barely had time to duck into the bathroom before the bedroom door swung open. Mr. Holloway walked in, followed by the same two men from before. His sharp, snake-like eyes scanned the room until they landed on Alexander. He froze. "You're awake," Holloway murmured. Alexander tilted his head, a slow, dark smile spreading across his lips. "Surprised to see me?" His voice was stronger now, his presence towering despite his weakened body. Holloway's face darkened. "You shouldn't be." "Yeah, well, it looks like I am," Alexander shot back, "and that's very bad news for you." One of the men in black took a step forward, but before he could move, Alexander pressed something on his phone. A deep, chilling silence filled the room. Then, a loud alarm blared through the entire mansion. Holloway's eyes widened. "What did you do?" Alexander smirked. "I called in reinforcements." The sound of multiple footsteps echoed in the halls, not from Holloway's men, but from Alexander's. Maria peeked from the bathroom, her heart racing. Within seconds, a group of armed security guards stormed in, weapons drawn. Holloway paled. "You really thought you could take everything from me?" Alexander's voice was pure ice. "You work for me, Holloway, and you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The guards moved fast, restraining Holloway and his men before they could react. Maria finally stepped out of the bathroom, relief crashing over her. It was over. Alexander turned to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You saved my life," he said softly, Maria swallowed. Maria. He took her hand, his touch surprisingly warm despite everything. I don't trust easily, but you risked everything for me. His thumb brushed over her fingers, a silent promise in his gaze. I won't forget that. Maria felt her heart pound in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Maybe saving him had been the right thing to do, but maybe, just maybe, it had also changed her life forever.